All right, hey everybody, welcome back. Good morning to you guys. There's 2 minutes or so until 10, so just getting things rolling and be with everyone in a few minutes. But I hope you had a great weekend and hope you're having a nice day so far. Good morning, hey Vlad. Hi Martina, Ivan. Good to see you guys. Okay, got another minute to go. How was the weekend? That was nice. Better air, so I was able to get back into my running routine. Yeah, no, I'm having a good first 5 weeks or 4 weeks, whatever, of class so far. Kind of wish we were all back at the physical campus, but not under these conditions. So yeah, I mean, can't complain. Gonna have a lot more work coming up though once these papers come in after you guys turn them in next week. But for now, anyway, it's pretty chill. Hey, Caroline, Chloe, Abigail, all you guys. Nice to see you. Okay, so welcome back. It's 10 now. I'm going to go ahead and get us. So at the conclusion of last meeting, if I'm correct, we had just talked about the different characters in the whole Robert McKim essay, right? And we talked about how they stand for these different types of reaction to the hiddenness of God. Like some people could be a skeptic and they just believe that since God is hidden, maybe there is no real such thing. Other people are going to be true believers that say, no, there's a reason God wants us to have faith, even despite the fact that we don't have this better evidence that he exists or that he remains hidden. And some people who kind of hedge their bets and say it's possible that because God is hidden, what he really is thinking is, I don't care if people believe in me or not, and that's why I'm going to be hidden, because it doesn't matter either way whether they believe. Or maybe the hiddenness indicates that God doesn't exist. So the tentative believer says the hiddenness could point in one of those two directions, no God or a hidden God that's not concerned with whether we believe. Now, McKim is the one who sides with the tentative believer's reaction. And I know you guys probably remember that all this was in reference to, at first, the hypothetical of the hidden emperor. But is that where we ended? You guys, just let me know if you remember and you have your notes handy. I believe that's accurate. We just got as far as describing these guys' response. Yeah? So from there, did we talk about the disadvantages of God's hiddenness? I think that's where we need to pick it up. But if not, let me know. Hey, good morning, everyone. But to my quick question, just to set our course, that's where we stopped. Okay, perfect. Thanks, Parker. So I'm going to quickly run through what he calls the disadvantages of God's hiddenness. This is what follows next after his initial setup of the hypothetical and his kind of breakdown of the three different characters and their various reactions. So he states what are called, now this is all from Robert McKim, still just finishing up his work, The Hiddenness of God. Okay, so now what we're going to list are what he claims to be disadvantages of God's hiddenness. Because obviously the whole beginning part of this essay where he says, okay, suppose there was this island where, you know, there was this rumor of a hidden emperor and people come and they ask the island dwellers, are you going to believe in this emperor or not? Even though no one's ever seen him, heard from him, or perceived him in any way. That's all just kind of set up to ask the question, well, what about God? Because God, in a way similar to the emperor, is kind of like hidden. So does it mean that that produces doubts whether he exists? For some it does, for others they believe, and for some they're just not sure. And they claim that maybe there's no God, or maybe there is, but being hidden doesn't seem like he cares whether we believe in him or not. Now, McKim states, here are some disadvantages of God being hidden. Here are some things about God being hidden that are not ideal and that would be better if he wasn't hidden. So for one, he makes the point that since God is hidden, that makes it harder for everyone to believe in God, makes it harder for people to believe. Okay, so that's one point. When you think about the fact that some people don't believe in God, now most people do. I think in our country it's up in the high 80s or something like that, percentage-wise, of people that are a member of some religion or not. But atheism and secularism is increasing actually as a proportion of the overall population, and the trend has accelerated over the last 100 years or so. So why is it that some people don't believe? Well, it's most of the time because the person just doesn't think that there's better proof. It's hard for some people to believe in things that they can't quite see or perceive, even indirectly. So what would be something that would make it so that there would be no atheists, like zero atheists? Well, certainly if God was to be revealed in an open way where everyone could just quickly confirm by some means that he existed, then no one would have any doubts at all. So if God is hidden, he's making it a little harder for everybody to come to the belief in him than it otherwise would be. And if it's a good thing to believe in God, and if it's a bad thing not to, then God being hidden is standing in the way of that being a little more widespread. So that's one disadvantage. To the extent that he's hidden, it produces doubts and disbelief in some that wouldn't be there if he was not hidden. Okay, so a second point is that it also makes it harder for people to have a close personal relationship with God. It's harder to have close personal relationship with God. Okay, so because God is hidden, another thing that it kind of makes harder for us is not just to come to the belief in the first place, but secondly, to maintain and establish this close personal relationship with God that is considered to be important. Now, in a lot of these major monotheistic world religions that we all know of, they say not only that one should believe in God, that's of course expected, but on top of that, you're also supposed to foster a close personal relationship with God, especially in the Christian religion. So think about what a close personal relationship really involves, though. It involves things like trust, communication, the sharing of intimate secrets, hopes, dreams, and fears, being vulnerable. And that's something that's hard for some people to do when the being on the other end of the relationship is hidden in a way. So I don't think anybody, though, would have any difficulty confessing their hopes, dreams, fears, being vulnerable, and having that type of intimacy with a being that's not hidden. But being hidden, some people wonder, is this all for nothing? Is there really any such thing to which I'm devoting myself in this kind of intimate way of a relationship? So the close personal relationship is important to theism, but because God is hidden, it's not as easy as it otherwise would be for everybody to form it and to maintain it. The third disadvantage that he mentions, so I'm going to erase the header and stuff up here so that I just have more room on the board to list the remaining disadvantages. So these was the first two here. The third one is that it also makes it harder for people to worship and devote themselves to God. So it makes it harder for people to devote themselves to and worship God. So a third disadvantage of God being hidden in this way is that it also makes it harder for people to enter into the devotional and worshipful stance towards God that is an expectation of religion. So you're supposed to believe in God, you're supposed to have this close personal relationship, but you're also supposed to literally worship God and devote yourself to him. You're supposed to praise God. You're supposed to try to spread the word of God to other people. You're supposed to submit to the will of God and, as they say, bow before the feet of this divine being. But it's very hard for some people to humble themselves enough to prostrate themselves before a divine being when the being is hidden. I don't think, though, that if God was out in the open, that anyone would have a problem with that. If God was easy to confirm that he exists and everyone could automatically do it, then I think people would rush. They would run, not walk, to be the most fervent supporter of the belief in God and the most devout. So because God is hidden, it makes people wonder, is there really any such being? And therefore, the passion and the devotion with which they would otherwise worship the being is harder for them to do. So God being hidden is making all three of these things harder. To believe in the first place, to have a close relationship, and to be utterly devoted and worshiping. And then two more. He also says because God is hidden, it creates social conflict and disagreement. Okay, so think about all the different conflicts in the world that have happened due to religious differences between members of different religions, sometimes even within one and the same religion. Just doctrinal and interdenominational disputes can drive wedges in societies. So wars have been fought, Christian crusades, Ottoman Empire, and the Irish Republican Army versus the Protestants, Sunni versus Shia in parts of the Middle East, Hindu versus Muslim in parts of India and Kashmir. So, religion sometimes divides people because they can't agree on the right religious principles or doctrines, and sometimes those are bitter conflicts that spill over into war or sectarian strife, civil war. Well, why is it that everyone in those cases is having these disagreements and conflicts? It's because they can't agree on what God has said and what his message is and what he wants us to do. But if God was not hidden, then he could eliminate all of these disagreements between people by just saying clearly, here's of my revelation to everybody, here's the nature of the true faith that I want you to practice. If God wasn't hidden, then he could get everyone on the same page, basically. The fact that we can have these different encampments of belief and tradition is simply because God being hidden allows us to construe differently our interpretations of what it is that God wants and what his message is. So that opens up the space for the conflict and disagreement. But we could all be in unison and as one if God was not hidden to kind of clarify the disagreements. And the final thing that he mentions, the last disadvantage of God being hidden, is that because God is hidden, it allows for con artists and frauds to operate. So. Okay, so have there ever been people who have operated cult movements, which have recruited people within their ranks and then literally led to their death or detachment from their family and friends or society? Yeah, I mean, the Jim Jones cult, the Heaven Gates cult. In either of these cases, mass suicide was the ending of these people that bought into it, right? And why did they do it? Well, it's because the charismatic cult leader will claim to his subjects that they have some type of direct connection to the Word of God, or that they're receiving some type of divine revelation, and they present themselves to their subjects as this kind of quasi-religious figure. Now, if God was not hidden, though, he could expose everybody who's using the idea of God or religion for their own purposes and not for the glorification of God, and then it would never be able to operate because they'd be exposed by God himself. But because God is hidden and remains cloaked in that kind of secret hiddenness, people who make these false claims about being, a messenger of God or having some type of direct intuition into the nature of the divine, they can operate undetected and with impunity. So, it's not so good that people find themselves caught up in these kind of mind control cult movements, or that in other cases people will use it for their financial bottom line. And if God wasn't hidden, then they couldn't possibly do that. So here are 5 assorted, as he calls them, disadvantages of God being hidden. And having presented them, he kind of restates his main conclusion, which is that he he sides with the opinion of the so-called tentative believer, the person who says that because God is hidden, he either doesn't exist or does, but choosing to remain hidden means he might not really care whether we believe in him or not. Because if he really wanted us to believe in him and he didn't want us to have to suffer through these disadvantages, then he wouldn't be hidden and we'd all believe in him. But it looks more as if God just kind of creates the world if he exists and leaves us to our own judgment about whether we believe in him or not, and doesn't necessarily provide us with an easy route to that belief. So I told you that you could consider this as another possible objection to Pascal to go along with Clifford. Clifford says you shouldn't believe things that are not based on good enough evidence. And Pascal says, but believe in God, though, even though it can't be proven, just because maybe if you're right, that would be great. In this case, you see McKim as a possible objection, because McKim says that even if God exists, the fact that he's hidden makes us wonder if he really cares whether we believe in him or not. And if we don't assume that God cares whether we believe in him or not, as McKim is proposing, then that would make the wager no longer make sense, because the wager is built around the idea that God would want you to believe and would not want you to not believe. So if you do believe and he exists, Pascal claims he'll send you to heaven. And if you don't believe and he exists, then Pascal claims that he'll either deny you heaven or send you to hell. So looking at those stakes and those possible benefits and risks, you'd rather choose to believe. But if one claims that it might not really matter to God whether you believe or not, then we would no longer be able to assume, as Pascal does, that the outcome for the believer is a reward, and that the outcome for a non-believer is a punishment. Perhaps God, not caring whether one believes or not, would not be impressed by the fact of your belief, even if he did exist, thus undermining the expected benefits that could come, as Pascal has assessed. And also, it could be that if God is not upset with people who don't believe, then that would not necessarily meet with his disapproval either. So it kind of throws off the whole logic of the wager, which is built around the premise that God wants you to believe and does not want you to not believe. If he's hidden, it looks like he's not just concerned with it, and therefore that sort of scrambles the whole logic of the Pascal wager. Okay, so we're done with this McKim, and now I want to go quickly over the work of Nicholas Everett. And that's the last author on this whole subject matter of philosophy of religion for us for now. Okay? Did McKim add anything into his argument about Christ, Davey? Well, yeah, so I was thinking a little bit about that. You could make the argument that, well, God being hidden is not really the right description of the facts, because if you adhere to Christianity, you would say, well, God didn't remain hidden when he sent, when he became incarnate as Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ is described as the Son of God, but also God incarnate, like God in the flesh, embodied as a human being. And so maybe by God having, entered the human world and being Christ, he actually wasn't hidden. And so we had the opportunity, or at least humans living at that time period, who recorded, his words and transmitted them down to the generations. They had first-person access to a living, breathing human being who was the actual flesh and blood embodiment of God. So I understand, Davey, that that's one way of trying to dispute with his overall presentation that God is hidden, and that just leaves us with these impossible doubts that either we have to settle on our own or just become skeptics. I guess what he's thinking, though, is that in the contemporary situation, living now in 2020, we are in a different time point in history than the early Christians who would have been in a position to witness the life and acts of Jesus. So maybe he wasn't hidden, perhaps, in the time period spoken of in the Gospels and in Scriptures, but today he is. But I do understand the subtlety that you're trying to raise here, that it might not be so straightforward as to make the claim that he's not been revealed to man in some way. And you can also make other arguments along those lines, like if some of the stories recorded in the Scriptures are true, like the resurrection of Christ and things, then that would be perhaps a way of God making sure that he was not hidden. But today these arrive to us as ancient Scriptures rather than contemporary accounts. So is it not hidden because of that fact, or is it? It's something that I guess is a matter of some debate. But it's a good point you make there, Davey. Okay, great. So last author, though, on this whole subject is Nicholas Everett. Okay, and his article is called Theism and Modern Science. Theism and Modern Science by Nicholas Everett, and this article was published in 2004. So it's relatively recent in history. Nicholas Everett is a British philosopher of science and of religion. Okay, now, Everett, in this paper, the big picture of his paper is that he's just trying to make the case to the reader that religion and science are kind of in conflict with each other. Now, that's something that probably is not a new idea to you. I'm sure you've heard it said before that if, in some way of thinking about it, that if a person is a very strictly religious, devout kind of person, then they might reject certain claims of science. Or that if a person is a very thoroughgoing, scientific realist, grounded in the, modern scientific tradition, then they're going to reject certain religious claims. Not everybody believes that science and religion are in tension with each other. Some people believe that that's just false, and that in the end they really agree, or that they don't overstep each other's boundaries. But anyway, Nicholas Everett does believe that there are these strong conflicts and contradictions between theism and modern science. And his whole goal in the paper is just to try and present to the reader what are those conflicts that make some say that if you're going to be really, really scientific in your way of thinking, then it crowds out the space for religion, or vice versa. He wants to make the case that there are those differences between them, and then just leave it up to your judgment. So to make his argument, on page 66, you'll see this kind of conceptual, formal argument. I'm going to put the argument here, and then I'm going to back it up with a scenario that he gives to explain it. So just bear with me as I write the argument, which at a first glance is going to look a little technical, but then we'll bring it down to earth. So first premise, there's two premises that lead to the conclusion. So the first premise, which I've numbered here, says this. If there is a being with nature N, make a little more room here. Then in that case, the being will produce change C in the world. Okay, so that's the first premise. The second premise continues from there by saying that, but the world does not display C. So the conclusion of the argument is that therefore, and we put the conclusion below this line, therefore there is evidence that the being does not exist. Okay, now, I understand just at a first glance it might look a little confusing, so let me try my best to help you understand the parts of this as we give an example. The first premise just says this. Suppose there's a being, you're just like kind of hypothesizing that it exists. You don't know, but the statement is that if there were a being with some type of nature, N, the letter N capitalized, just is a placeholder to stand for whatever the nature of the being might be in the case. So if there's a being with some type of nature and some goal, and this letter I just stands for whatever the goal or the intention the being might have. So say you have a belief that there's some being, or you're suggesting the possibility of some being with nature N and intention I. That by itself will give you the ability to predict what type of behavior that being would do. And that's what the letter C stands for here in premise 1. So change C would be the expected behavior you would expect to see if that being with that nature and intention did exist. Okay. The second premise just adds and continues that having looked for that behavior or change in the world, you don't see it anywhere. So having looked for the behavior you would have expected in case the being did exist and not having found it, you reach the conclusion that therefore you've gained evidence. There's some evidence that the being does not exist. Now, to make this a little more concrete, let me tell you about the example that the author uses to try and make the point. So imagine the scenario here. It's a hypothetical scenario. So imagine a scenario where someone is washed ashore, shipwrecked on an island, and they're by themselves, and it looks like it's just a deserted island. So there have been a couple of different films and literature pieces over history that have explored this type of premise. If you've ever heard of Robinson Crusoe, kind of a classic of English literature, Robinson Crusoe's shipwrecked sailor. More recently, there was a film called, have any of you ever heard of Castaway with Tom Hanks, kind of famous actor? Castaway is exactly this type of plot. In that movie, he's stuck on an island that he kind of got stuck on because of a aviation accident, and then he befriends like a volleyball. Does anybody know the movie? Because I don't want to just make a reference that nobody knows about. If any of you have seen it, then great. But if you haven't, imagine a plot line like that, like the Castaway plot line, or like Robinson Crusoe, or if you know about old classic TV, Gilligan's Island, but Gilligan's a little different because it's a group. So we're thinking of one guy, okay? Yeah, Wilson, good. One guy washes ashore on the island. Now, it could be from, the transport vessel broke down, whether it was a boat or a plane. He might have used his life raft after the accident and found himself capable of swimming/floating towards the shore, and he arrives on the shore now. Okay, so good. Put that situation in your mind. Here we have a person who's washed ashore on a deserted island. And the person now that is there is thinking this thought. They're thinking, am I the only one, though, that actually survived the crash? Maybe there was another person who was lucky, like me, to have grabbed like a piece of plywood or a life raft, and who also floated up to the island that I'm on. And the person who's there now wonders whether there's someone else, because they would like that. If there was another person, then of course they could band together, help each other survive, and wait for like a rescue mission, and keep each other company. So he thinks to himself, okay, looking at premise one now, if there is another survivor on this island who's a person like me and who wants to be discovered and who wants to get off the island, then in that case, they would do certain things on the island. And he's going to go looking for those things to see if there's someone else. So change C in this example will just stand for whatever you'd expect another survivor to be doing on the island. So what do you think would be the sort of signs that you'd be going out searching for if you were in this person's position? Your mission now is seek to find whether there's another survivor. So you'd be looking out for, as you explore the island, such things as what? How would you conduct that search? You got to know what to look for. So even before you get up off of the beach, you're thinking, I'm going to go out and I'm going to look for stuff like, okay, good, like a shelter perhaps. Maybe there's another survivor who's built a little enclosure. Or maybe at the least, if not a shelter, you're going to find, if you look for it, what things? You can build on that. Shelter maybe, or, toss a few more things out. Smoke, yeah, maybe they're creating smoke signals and trying to be found that way, or maybe they just created a fire pit and they're trying to cook using that. Maybe there are footprints, maybe they have made noises, maybe they've created SOS signs in the sand, trails, exactly. Human clothes, shoes, any signs of life of another human out there, okay? So that kind of stuff, generally speaking, is what fits the description of this placeholder. So now imagine that the shipwrecked individual goes through the whole island, exploring it very thoroughly, trying to find that type of stuff that we just talked about. But doesn't see any such things. So you follow the whole scenario, right? He's on the island. What? Is there anyone else? Okay, maybe. If so, they might leave behind these type of signs. I'm going to go look for them. I've looked everywhere. I didn't see any of those signs. Now, having not seen any such signs, the person can come to what conclusion? If you kind of put all that together, what conclusion can our stranded sailor or whatever come to after that? They did their search. They investigated the island. No signs turned up. Now they've got evidence of what? That no one's there. Now they have got evidence that no one's there. They didn't have that evidence necessarily until they did the search looking for the signs, but didn't turn up any such signs. Okay, yeah, so good. reference Rachel, that maybe it's just them and Wilson or their other imaginary friend. Okay, so now, this kind of argument is next going to be used by the author to try and make the case that the universe that we live in, at least according to the scientific investigation of it, is not the type of universe that you would have expected in case it was really made by God for the sake of mankind. So the equivalent of going out in the island looking for signs and not seeing any is looking at the universe scientifically and seeing that it's not the way you would have expected, basically, if it had really been created by God. So the universe revealed by science is not the type of universe that we would expect in case theism is true. That's the big picture here. But let me give you one other example of this just to kind of make the point even clearer. Because, I mean, this is a hypothetical. I have a real life scenario that's kind of funny that might make it a little more relatable. So when I was a little kid way back in the days, when I was even 5 and 6, so I was hearing the same stories everyone has heard around the holidays about Santa Claus. And, my parents are saying, get ready for Christmas. Santa's going to bring you blah, 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 these gifts. And maybe it just shows you that I was destined to be a philosopher someday, because I was already thinking thoughts, critical thoughts. I was thinking as a little boy, is it true though what they've said to me about Santa? Or are they just tricking me? Because it sounds like a funny story that they say that he could fly with a sleigh, but I don't think sleigh could fly because, it's earthbound and it's driven by reindeer. And I couldn't understand that either, because I know that reindeer don't have wings or anything. I also wondered, how could he possibly have all that cargo with him in a simple sleigh? Because we're talking about millions and billions of gifts, but I don't see how the sleigh could hold it. So, I had all these doubts. And parents, of course, they just paper over that, say, oh, don't worry, it's magic or something. But I couldn't take their word for it. So what happened was, on Christmas Eve, I decided, when everyone goes to bed, I'm going to stay up and just stare at the chimney, because we had a chimney. And the story of Santa Claus, that he's supposed to come down the chimney and give you gifts under the tree. So I said to myself, well, if there is this mythical gift giver who wants to come and give me gifts tonight, then there's certain things that he's going to do if I just shop here. So I set up shop sitting there, and I thought, okay, if he's going to come, then if he exists, what I'll see is that there's a man in a red suit that'll come down the chimney. And even if I don't hear that, I should at least hear ho, 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 shouted from the rooftop, or I should hear the sleigh bells jingling, or the pitter-pat of the hooves of these reindeer. So I thought, if what they're saying is true, I've got to see some of these signs, and I'm going to stay up and look for them. But of course, to my disappointment or whatever, none of those signs happened, even though I got gifts, so I didn't really care much. But to my disappointment, I didn't see any of those signs. So that's premise 2, right? It's like the guy on the island looking for the things he thought he would find if there was someone there, but not finding them. And so that gave me some reason to think there's actually no such thing as Santa. I'm not trying to compare Santa Claus to God or anything like that. I would never do that. But I'm just trying to give you an example that kind of fits the same format as we see here. So the big picture is basically this argument says, if you have some reasonable guess or judgment about what a being would be likely to do, if it existed, then go out and look for those signs. And if you don't see them, then that gives you some evidence of no such being. Now, when it comes to the real concept of God, here's what he says to conclude his paper. That the kind of universe we would expect to have if God created it would be one made for the sake of mankind, right? Because according to traditional theism, God didn't just make humans randomly. He made the universe specifically with humans in mind, because we're supposed to be created in the image of God. We're the children of God. And that means that we are supposed to have a specific kind of pride of place in the universe. We're the crown jewel of the creation, as they say. If God created it for the sake of mankind, then everything should be revolving around humans in a way. And so here's what the universe would be like, so he claims, if it was really created by a divine being for the sake of man. So this would be the apt universe, as he calls it. Apt universe if it was created by God. Just like, the apt behavior that you'd find on the island if there was another survivor are those tracks and sounds, etc., etc. So apt universe here is the stand-in for what you would be expecting in case the being of God existed now. So for one, you'd expect that man would appear early in the universe. Also, man would appear not long after the other animals, he says. Okay. Also, we would be in the center, so the Earth would be in the center of the universe. And then finally, the universe overall would not be so much vastly larger than the Earth. Okay, so four kind of features that you'd expect the universe to exhibit if the hypothesis of God is true. Because, again, if God makes the universe for man, then we should occupy a privileged place within the universe, and it should revolve around us in a sense. So if God made the universe for man, then wouldn't you expect mankind to appear very early in the overall timeline of the universe's history? What would be the point, for example, of creating a universe for the sake of man, but then not putting any humans in it for billions and billions of years until the very tail end of history? You'd expect, as it says in Genesis, that man would appear early within the first 7 days of creation, which is what is claimed in Genesis, because that's what would make sense on the hypothesis that God created the universe for man. It would not make as much sense to suppose that he created the universe and then delayed the installation of man for billions, billions, billions of years. Second, not only would we appear early in the overall timeline of the universe, but you'd think that we would appear not too much later after the other non-human animals. Now, certainly we might appear sometime after them so that they could already be available for us to use as food and clothing and whatever, transportation like horses and horse-drawn carriages and stuff. But why would we have appeared so much later after the other animals? There would not be much of a point if the universe was created just for us to have all these things that are not humans way before us. If the point of the universe's creation was to create a place for human habitation, then why leave humans absent in the universe and all these other non-human animals for the bulk of even the Earth's history? Third, you'd expect that the Earth would be right in the middle of everything, in the center of the universe, and everything would literally just revolve around us. Now, that was actually a very important idea to the early Christian church all the way up through the medieval period. They insisted on the idea that the Earth was at the center of the cosmos. Well, for one, they thought that we weren't moving, because if the planet was moving, then when you jumped up off the ground, it would slide underneath you, but it doesn't appear to do that. They also thought that the Earth had to be in the middle because God would not want us to be in a peripheral or non-central position. So like when telescopes were invented with greater powers of observation, people like Galileo and Copernicus were able to determine that we are rotating around the sun and not the other way around. But that was considered so unorthodox and heretical at the time that even though they were just using scientific empirical observations through telescopes, Galileo in particular was threatened with death if he didn't recant his testimony, even though he was up in his 70s and half blind from looking at the sun and stuff through these old telescopes. Now, of course, hundreds of years have passed, and the church and everybody has apologized for that, and everyone recognizes that it's in fact undisputed that the Earth's not even in the center of our local solar system, much less the center of the whole cosmos. But that just demonstrates again how important it was and how unintuitive it would have been for early Christian church to conceive of the Earth as just being in some random non-central position. And finally, it would have also been assumed that if God created the universe just for mankind, then things would be more on a human scale in terms of the overall size of space. Why should there be vast regions of the universe and the cosmos that not only can we not explore or travel to, but in many cases can't even see? You'd think that the universe would be shrunk down to the size of the Earth a little bit, because why should there be all this additional unused space that has nothing to do with man if the whole universe is created for the sake of human beings on the planet Earth? And if you go back a way long time ago, like to the ancient Greeks, they also thought maybe that the universe was kind of small in comparison to the Earth. Like at that time, some thought that the stars that we see in the night sky, which today, of course, we know are very, very distant objects shining light, they were believed in some circles to be merely pinholes that are poked in a shell, which encases the firmament that surrounds the Earth. And that's not distant stars. Those are just like light from the heavens penetrating through the poked holes in this kind of like pinholes in this shell that surrounds the Earth. But anyway, now to the real conclusion. As we look at science, though, all four of these things would appear to be false, at least according to the scientific consensus view of the universe. So, we could go down the list. First of all, mankind's emergence into the physical universe, estimates vary, but even if we have a pretty broad range between like 100,000 to 500,000 years for the current form of Homo sapiens, that's really just the tail end of the overall timeline of the history of the universe, which is between 12 and 15 billion years. That's like saying if we had a 26-mile line, human beings appear at the last 2 inches of that line. So we're not like early to the party, as it were. We're very late. And if the universe was made for the sake of mankind, then how come we only appear in the last like flash of an instant of the overall scope of time of the universe? Secondly, even on the planet Earth, we're quite late to the show, as it were, because for 99% of the Earth's own existence, the life forms on the planet were not Homo sapiens, at least according to evolution. The early time period of Earth's history, which has existed for like 4 billion years, is microbial life and single-cell life forms, and it took a very, very long time for those to evolve and specialize into vertebrate life and mammalian life, and then eventually, Homo sapiens, which we are. So, why wouldn't we have appeared way at the beginning, fully formed, as they say in Genesis, if God created the universe? We would have, you'd think. But at least according to evolution, that's not seen. So another, perhaps, conflict between the scientific consensus and the religious assumption. Rachel, people are inherently selfish, so would it be safe to assume that these sort of narcissistic claims that humans came up with don't need to be true for an all-powerful being to exist? That God would place on mankind because we're created in his image. Not to say that we're better than we are or something, but isn't that just what the religious texts promote? Now, I think the religious, the strict religious adherent is not going to want to concede these points. They're going to say, no. In the Genesis book, we were created within the first week. And we did not evolve. Creationism is true. So we were fully formed in the Garden of Eden within the first 7 days of creation. These things are therefore true according to like a very traditional religious approach. So it's not narcissistic atheists or something that are making these claims. These claims are just part and parcel of what religious assumptions imply. If God created the universe for the sake of man, now, we could relax those assumptions. Perhaps that's what you suggest, Rachel, and the author talks about that. Perhaps if we think that the scientific consensus contradicts this, then one way to reconcile the conflicts is to say that maybe God didn't intend to create the universe for the sake of man particularly. Like, so in your follow-up comment, you say maybe not the Christian God, but still a God. Sure. You could then argue that God, it's too much hubris and it's too presumptive for human beings to even claim that they know enough about the intentions and the will of God to say that we have facts that contradict this stuff, because maybe these are not safe assumptions, and that's a little bit, as you put it, narcissistic to presume. Yes, you could argue that, but it somewhat runs counter to baseline assumptions that at least the author thinks are found within religion. Not that he's foisting them upon religion, but that religion, in a way, if you read the scriptures, interprets the world to be that way. But that's a very reasonable and good question, so I'm glad that you did ask that. Nonetheless, we just have to work with the material provided by the author, right? So even if we don't agree with everything they say, and never really should you, these are just arguments to consider, not to necessarily agree or disagree with, unless your judgment has it that way. We still want to just understand the author's argument as they present it. So I hope you can at least follow what he intends to present here, right? And that is just that reasonably, if God created the universe for man, you'd expect it to be like this. If we grant him that assumption, then he follows it by saying that in scientific analysis of the universe if we don't discover it to be that way. And then, we're not in the center of the universe. I was just going to mention the third point. We're not even in the center of the local cosmos. I think I told you guys about Galileo and Copernicus, and that's something that is undisputed now. And then about the size of the overall universe, it's definitely way bigger than the Earth. The scale of the universe is one of the most mind-boggling things. I mean, for you to even get to the next closest star in our galaxy, which is Alpha Centauri, you'd have to travel 4 light years. And so that's the speed of light, which is maximum physical speed, 186,000 miles per second, not per hour, but every second, going 186,000 miles. And doing that for a full 4-year presidential term. That would be the amount of travel and distance and speed you'd need just to get to the next star. But not only are there billions of stars, there's billions of galaxies which house the stars. So the universe and the scale of time and space is vast. So, I mean, it makes it appear as though the Earth is not this central hub of which, all important life exists, but rather just a tiny speck of dust in a much larger, manifold of space and time. So that's how Everett rests his argument. He says maybe religion is true and the scientific consensus is wrong, or maybe the scientific consensus is correct and the religious claims are incorrect, or maybe we've misinterpreted what the universe would be like in case it was created by God. But whichever way you go, he does believe that this shows us that there are some conflicts and some tensions between a certain approach to religion and a certain understanding of, our scientific best theories that we have right now about the universe. Okay, so with that, we're done with the Everett. And I'm going to make one slight, edit to the syllabus, which is that I'm going to have to take one author out in order to make some additional room. So Wednesday's meeting was originally listed as JJC Smart and Extreme and Restricted Utilitarianism, but we're going to have to cover John Stuart Mill during that meeting and maybe part of Friday's meeting too. So what I'm asking is that we will simply strike the JJC Smart article off the list, and that will give us room on Wednesday and maybe the beginning of Friday to just finish off all the notes on John Stuart Mill. So we now move on to the next unit of the class, which is ethics. And ethics is all about the study of morality and moral concepts. There's some very powerful ethical theories that have been developed in the Western tradition, and we're going to try and just survey the 2 big major rivals in ethics. So one ethical theory that we're going to study to start is called utilitarianism, and that's been written about by John Stuart Mill, a British philosopher of the 19th century, of the 1800s. And then there's another major ethical theory that is kind of the rival to that in a way, and that comes from the writing of a German philosopher named Immanuel Kant from the 18th century and 1700s. So it's kind of Mill versus Kant, 2 big ethical heavyweights that we're going to compare and contrast with each other. So I'm going to erase this board and just make some general comments about that, and that's where we'll kind of, pick up on Wednesday. Don't forget, again, as I said, that your first paper is due next Wednesday, and you got still plenty of time to write it and to try and at least hammer out a draft and get your thoughts down on the page. Anybody who's thinking about using the Everett article, you can make some reference to it if you wanted to in a paper, although it's not maybe too essential for the work of the second prompt, but I can imagine it being woven into either one, I guess. On the one hand, Pascal says there's no way to prove that either God exists or doesn't exist, so it's just totally an open question, and both sides, are equally incapable of proof. So the only thing you've got to choose is which wager are you going to take in view of the stakes of wagering on the one hand or wagering on the other hand. You could argue, I guess, in light of Everett, that if Everett is correct, then it's not really true that there's no evidence against God, because as he sees it, there's scientific evidence that contradicts at least certain traditional religious assumptions. So, I mean, that's one way of trying to push back against his opening statement that there cannot be evidence on either side to prove or disprove. So let's just look at the wager. What does God think of the trolley car? Oh, you're talking about the trolley problem case? Well, good question. We will definitely cover that in a few weeks. That's one of our essays to kind of close the topic of ethics. But I don't want to say much about it until we get there. Anybody who's interested in the trolley problem can read ahead in the book. And there's also a whole world of memes that are a little bit silly and dark humor, but quite funny to me anyway. The trolley problem memes, there's a Facebook page that has just a hilarious assortment of variations on the case. Yes, Tristan, keep that in mind. That's going to come back to either haunt us or entertain us in a few weeks. So yeah, you got all your options anyway on the first topic. But with 1 or 2 minutes in class left, I'm just going to write the word ethics here. And this is the study of morality and moral concepts. This is the new field of philosophy that we're branching into. Oh, good reference, Rachel. Yes, The Good Place has an interesting, funny episode on the trolley problem. So I've actually used that before in some classes where we're teaching this. So I'm glad you know about it. Ethics is the study of morality and moral concepts. So morality covers a pretty broad range of terms and topics. It's the sort of area where we question and interrogate things like what is right and wrong, what is good and bad, what is moral and immoral, how ought a person to act versus how a person ought not to act. So some of us really receive our moral intuitions from our upbringing, from the values imparted onto us by our parents, by our community, by our society. Sometimes it has to do with a person's religious beliefs and values, and sometimes just their general humanistic concerns about each other. But what we're trying to do now is analyze what have been the most intelligent and well-stated accounts of ethical theory that have been written in the West. There's several to choose from, but I'm kind of going with the biggest two that are out there. There's utilitarian ethics and Kantian ethics. So some interesting ethical systems have been developed by writers, and they try to state principles which allow us to classify an action as being either moral or immoral, as either being permitted by morality and the moral law or violating it. So we're going to start to try and build up this terminology, and we're going to start talking about John Stuart Mill. So read John Stuart Mill, Utilitarianism, if you have not already read it, for the Wednesday meeting, and then that'll occupy our time Wednesday and maybe a little piece of the beginning on Friday. Okay, so does that sound good to everybody? I think we've reached our time for today's meeting. Are you guys good? Let me know. If so, thanks again for everything and for your... I guess I'll guys back. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thanks everyone. Take care then and have a good one. I hope you have a good start to your week. Bye-bye.